Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books. Today I'm here with Lady to talk about how I read so much. So I've been doing my wrap-ups of all the all the books I'm reading in 2023, and I am actually past 100 books that I've read so far in 2023, but I think I've posted only up to like book number 80 or so, which has led to the question of how I'm reading so much. And I think it's something that's worthwhile talking about, because I think that for somebody who's not immersed in booktube or book talk or bookstagram, it might seem like you're behind somehow from people who are reading a lot more. But one of the things that people don't always talk about is that they have time. Right now I'm only teaching one class, so I have a lot more time to read. And that's important, right? This is not a 40-hour job I'm doing at the moment, because when I'm only teaching one class. I'm actually doing a lot more than I am getting paid for, because of grading and class prepping and remaking lessons and all of that. But it still means that I have a large chunk of my day that I can dedicate to reading. And if you look at people that are reading like 200 plus books, a lot of times that is the case. Like, they might be book influencers for a living, and that is one of the reasons why they might be reading a ton. They might also be reading shorter books, which is a legitimate way to read a lot of books. So that is something you might consider if you're trying to read a lot of books. The other thing to consider, though, is that you don't need to read as much as somebody who's reading 200 plus books, or as much as I'm reading, because there's no requirement. Like, there's no book police that's going to come to your house and like get mad at you because you didn't read enough books, or the same amount of books as somebody who makes videos about books for a living. So please keep that in mind, that one, having a full-time job might not be conducive to reading 100 plus books in a year. If you read one book a year, that is already enough. If you read part of a book in a year, that is enough, unless that you really want to read more. And so that's the group of people that I think my tips are for. People that are actively trying to read more and are looking for some ideas on how to do that. So what the main thing that I do that helps me read more during the year and during the week even is making time for it, right? So I do watch a lot of television. I consume a lot of social media. I'm on social media a lot, and I still make time for reading. Oftentimes that means, I spend some time on social media and then I put my phone down and pick up a book. Or what I've done that it works really well for me, because I'm a night person, I'm a night owl, is I read before bed. And for me, that sometimes means reading 3-4 plus hours in the evening. Again, that works because I'm a night owl. So if you're a morning person, for example, maybe that's the first thing you do in the morning after you get ready, is you pick up a book with your coffee or your tea and you read for a certain amount of time. And you don't have to be reading hours at a time. You want to start, if you're just starting to wanting to read more, you want to start with whatever is feasible. So whether it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes, even 10 minutes, building the habit is really important. And so you want to start with something that is very doable for you, so that you start doing it every day or every other day, and you're building the habit of making that time every day for your reading. So whether you're reading in the morning, in the evenings, in the afternoon, maybe during your lunch break. I see a lot of people that work full-time jobs, and then they'll show in their like Instagram stories or on TikTok that they're picking up their book during their lunch break. So that means they're only reading for like 15-20 minutes, maybe half an hour at most for that. You have to find those times in your schedule when it is feasible to add those little bit of minutes to read, right? The other thing to think about is what you're reading. A lot of times, if we're just starting to want to read more again, or for the first time ever, I see sometimes people picking up like heavy academic books because they want to read more nonfiction, for example. It's like, ooh, okay, don't pick something too heavy, don't pick something too academic, too thick to read. Maybe you don't start with literary fiction, right? You don't start with an author that is known to be very heavy. You want to start with something lighter. So for example, I started getting back into reading after finishing graduate school. So for me, college and graduate school meant I was reading a lot and mostly for classes. And it meant that I was mostly not having a lot of time to read for fun. And so when I finished my PhD, I was burnt out for a while, like just completely burnt out. I could not pick up anything to read, certainly nothing nonfiction or history, because that's what I'd spent the last decade plus of my life reading. So so when I decided, hey, I've always been a reader. I want to get back into reading. This is something that's important to me. It's an important part of who I am, and I'm making time for it. I did not start off trying to read academic history. I was too burnt out of it. So instead, I started reading YA, right? And YA is meant for younger readers, for teenage readers, and so that felt a lot easier to me. I also like that the themes, while there are dark and heavier themes in YA, that it was much more manageable reading it in that young adult format. Other formats that you might think about is starting with short stories. That way you pick up a short story collection, but you're not investing necessarily like the whole length of the book. You're gonna read just short stories within this collection, and by taking it one story at a time, it makes it more manageable and less of a, oh my god, I need to read this whole book. No, you focus on reading one story at a time. Novellas, there's tons of novellas on online that you can buy an ebook of, and that are very short, so you're not investing hours of your life on it. You are spending maybe 1.5 to 2 hours, depending on the speed at which you read at, to read a novella. Something like that is so much more manageable. It might still take you longer, right? It might, if you're only reading 15 minutes at a time, for example, it might still take you a week or 2 weeks to read it, and that's perfectly okay. That is like, the key is to not be hard on yourself at first that you're not reading more, because that's what it takes to build a habit, is just little bits at a time that later will add up to longer, and little by little you'll be able to increase the amount of time that you're spending reading. For a lot of us, if you spend a lot of time on your phone or on social media, our attention span does decrease, because we're consuming information in very short bursts, and so we tend to not have a longer attention span. So a lot of times picking up a longer book, it's just not going to be doable at first, because we haven't built up that attention span back up. That's kind of important. The other thing is to think of the things you consider reading. Rethink what you consider reading. So for example, I know for a lot of young kids, reading comic books, a lot of parents and even teachers try to discourage students or kids, or try to tell them that that's not actual reading, when it is. Reading comic books, reading graphic novels counts as reading. And initially that might be like the only format that works for you. And if that is the case, there are fantastic graphic novels these days, nonfiction graphic novels, romance graphic novels, a sci-fi, superhero, whatever genre interests you, pick that up. And the graphic novel allows you to, one, have visual aids, right? Have the images that are also part of the storytelling process there. And so you are reading, you're consuming stories via the graphic novel or comic format. And that is a fantastic way to get back into reading. The other thing is audiobooks and ebooks, right? A lot of times, because we're so used to reading things on a device, it might be easier for you to, or because of some sort of ADHD or some other reason, it might just be easier to read a book on an ebook. It might be easier on your eyes to read it on a tablet, to read on a phone, so an ebook is preferable if that is easier. And you don't have to buy like a Kindle or a Nook or some extra device in order to consume ebooks. You can read them on the tablet you already have. You can even read them on the phone. However, if it's too much on your eyes, if you're already spending too much time on those devices, then it might not be feasible. Things like Kindle have, for example, particular e-readers that are meant to mimic the format of physical books, so they can be a lot less harsher on your eyes than reading on like a tablet or a phone. And then the other format is audiobooks. I've had this conversation with my students a lot when I assigning a physical book for them to read, I have to remind them that it's not cheating to listen to an audiobook. For some people, that is the best format to consume stories, and you want to pick the format. You want to play around with what format is easier for you, which format is going to help you kind of be able to devote more time to reading if that's what you want to do. Audiobooks are also really great for fitting a lot more reading in when you have something like a commute. So I used to have a really long commute to work years before the pandemic, and audiobooks was the best way. They were such a lifesaver. One, they helped keep me awake in traffic. They helped kind of keep me company in traffic, because being in traffic for over an hour can be so exhausting, so boring, and just so many different things. And audiobooks were frankly a lifesaver for me in that during those years where I had a really long commute, because they just, oh my goodness, my brain wanted to shut off when I was making those drives. And I've never been a podcast person. I like listening to music on the radio when driving, but then after a while I felt like I knew what song was going to come up on the radio, like I knew the lineup of the songs. I was in traffic at the same time of the day every day, and I needed something else, and audiobooks were a lifesaver. And you don't need to purchase any of these, by the way. The other thing is to remember that your library, if you use the library apps, which most libraries have either like Libby, Overdrive, those kinds of apps where you check out books from the library in ebook and audiobook format, so you don't have to go out and like buy really expensive books or buy a subscription to something like Audible or something. You don't have to spend extra money in order to fit more reading into your life. However, like if those don't work for you, well, one, I think it's worth trying audiobooks and ebooks, for example, but they might not work for you, in which case physical book is going to be the way for you to do it. And libraries are also great resources that way, so that you can have physical books in front of you that will help you start reading more and building that habit of reading more. So those are my tips, but again, I don't want anybody to feel like they have to be reading more, or to look at, for example, the amount of reading I'm doing, or people that read even more than I do, and feel like, oh my goodness, I'm way behind, I need to be reading that amount. You don't. You really, really don't. When I first started looking at BookTube, people that make videos on YouTube about books, I felt like I was way behind, and I really had to remind myself that it's not competition, that people have a lot more time to read than I had at the time, and so that was partly why they were reading so much. Also, some people are really fast readers, and I think some people think that I'm a really fast reader. I don't think I'm a very fast reader, but it's also something that you develop with time, the ability to read a little bit faster, and it depends on the format. Like I've noticed when I'm reading on my e-reader, because it tells me how much longer I have till I finish the book, I tend to kind of want to race with myself to improve those stats. So I tend to read a little bit faster. Sometimes if I'm reading a lot of thrillers or romance novels, those are much easier to read. I tend to read those faster, so I get a lot more reading in when I'm reading a lot of that kind of books. If I'm reading heavier nonfiction, for example, then those take me a lot longer. They also take me longer if I'm reading something because it's something I'm reading for my work, right? If I'm going to develop a lecture on a new topic and I'm reading a book to use to develop that lecture, then I'm going to read it a lot slower and a lot carefully, because I'm taking notes as I go, or I'm building that lecture or that activity that I'm going to do with my class, so it does take me longer. So those are all things to consider if you're trying to fit more reading into your life. And the other thing is YouTube, TikTok, Instagram are great ways to start finding a community of other readers, right? Find other people that you're interacting with on a regular basis that help encourage that habit without putting pressure on yourself, right? You want to find people that are not going to make you feel pressured to read a ton, that it's just about reading a little bit more, just building that habit. So So that is it for me. Let me know if you have other tips, especially not so much for me, right? But tips that we can share as a community as to things you do that might help others if they are trying to read a little bit more during the day, in the evening, throughout the year. I think sharing tips that work for you is fantastic, because not everything's going to work for all of us. Like, things I do might not work for you, but something somebody else does might really work for you. And so sharing that in the comments, I think, would be really fantastic. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.